While all eyes are locked on the upcoming face-to-face between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska, two other flashpoints are heating up, and if they boil over, the United States could be facing the unthinkable. Multiple wars on multiple fronts at the same time. This isn't just speculation. On August 15th, right here on U.S. soil, the leaders of the two largest nuclear powers will sit down in Anchorage to discuss the future of a war that has already redrawn the map of Europe. And while that's happening, China is tightening its grip in the Pacific, and the Middle East is inching toward a dangerous escalation. This is not just another diplomatic photo op. This is the first in-person meeting between the U.S. president and the Russian leader since the height of the Ukraine war. According to The Guardian, the talks are expected to focus on Ukraine, with Moscow pushing for recognition of territory it has seized since 2022 in exchange for halting further expansion. These proposals, often called land swaps in diplomatic circles, sound like a shortcut to peace, but Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has already rejected them outright. He told Reuters such concessions would be an invitation to future aggression, warning that accepting them would only embolden Moscow to come back for more. NATO allies are watching closely, because the outcome of these talks could either strengthen or weaken the alliance's most important principle. Article 5. For those unfamiliar, Article 5 of the NATO Treaty says that an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against all, a mutual defense guarantee that's only credible if the United States is willing to back it up. And here's where the timing becomes critical. While this high-stakes meeting plays out, Beijing is ramping up military pressure near Taiwan, and in the Middle East, fighting between Israel and Hamas could spiral into a broader regional conflict involving Iran. The setting is no accident. Anchorage, Alaska is not only U.S. territory but also one of the closest American cities to Russia, less than 600 miles from the Russian Far East across the Bering Strait. That proximity has always been strategically significant. During the Cold War, Alaska was a frontline state in America's air defense network, with radar stations and interceptor bases watching for Soviet bombers. Today, that same geography makes Anchorage a symbolic and practical choice for a high-stakes meeting between two nuclear powers. According to CBS News, the August 15th summit will be held at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, a secure military installation that has hosted heads of state before and can provide both the privacy and the security this kind of discussion demands. The agenda will be dominated by the war in Ukraine, but sources close to the talks suggest it will go far beyond the battlefield. Moscow's position, based on leaks reported by Reuters, is that Russia wants formal recognition of its control over Crimea and the 4 Ukrainian regions it claimed to annex in 2022: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. In exchange, the Kremlin says it would agree to a ceasefire and commit, on paper, not to advance further. This is what diplomats sometimes call a frozen conflict arrangement, where the shooting stops but the underlying dispute remains unresolved. From Washington's perspective, the calculus is complex and politically risky. Accepting such a deal could sharply reduce U.S. military aid commitments to Kyiv, freeing up resources for other pressing theaters like the Pacific or the Middle East. It could also give the American public the appearance of a diplomatic win, avoiding a long and costly war of attrition. But the risks are enormous. Agreeing to territorial concessions taken by force would send a message not just to Moscow, but to every other capital watching, that borders can be changed through aggression if you're strong enough to get away with it. That would undermine a principle the United States has defended since the end of World War II, that the international order is built on the inviolability of sovereign borders. European leaders, particularly in Poland and the Baltic states, are sounding alarms. These countries live under the shadow of Russian military power, and their history with Moscow makes them deeply skeptical of any deal that rewards aggression. As the Council on Foreign Relations has noted, they fear that a weak deal now would not mark the end of the crisis, but the beginning of a new cycle, one where Russia pauses, regroups, and strikes again in the future. And then there's the wild card. What happens if the talks fail? History offers a clear pattern. When high-level negotiations collapse, both sides often try to improve their bargaining positions on the ground. For Russia, that could mean launching a new offensive to capture more territory before coming back to the table. For Ukraine, it could mean pressing Washington and NATO for even more weapons and support. That, in turn, would force the U.S. to ramp up aid at a time when its military commitments are already global in scope. The Pentagon knows that sustaining large-scale assistance to Ukraine while preparing for potential crises in the Pacific and the Middle East would stretch both resources and readiness to their limits, a scenario America's defense planners would prefer to avoid, but one they can't ignore. At the same time, Washington and Beijing have announced a 90-day suspension of new tariffs. The Associated Press describes it as a pause to create space for dialogue, a window during which negotiators will try to address trade imbalances and intellectual property disputes that have strained U.S.-China relations for years. Economically, this truce is a welcome breather for American importers, particularly in sectors like electronics, consumer goods, and automotive manufacturing, which have been hit hard by higher costs. But while tariffs may be on hold, military tensions have not eased, and in some ways, they are intensifying. The Guardian reports that in just the last week, the People's Liberation Army Navy has carried out multiple exercises around Taiwan, including mock blockades and amphibious landing drills. These maneuvers are not mere training, they are rehearsals for a potential invasion scenario. For context, Taiwan is a self-governing island about 100 miles off China's coast, home to 23 million people and a critical hub for semiconductor manufacturing. According to the Semiconductor Industry Association, Taiwan produces more than 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced chips, the kind used in everything from smartphones to advanced weapon systems. Losing access to that supply would cripple industries and military capabilities worldwide, and Washington knows it. Beijing considers Taiwan a breakaway province, a legacy of the Chinese Civil War that ended in 1949, and has never ruled out using force to bring it under its control. The United States has long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, deliberately avoiding a clear commitment on whether it would intervene militarily if China attacked, while at the same time selling Taiwan advanced weapons, sharing intelligence, and conducting joint training exercises. This ambiguity is meant to deter both sides, discouraging Beijing from attempting an invasion and discouraging Taipei from declaring formal independence. The danger lies in the narrow margin for error. In recent months, Chinese fighter jets have crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait with increasing frequency, forcing Taiwan's Air Force to scramble in response. U.S. reconnaissance planes have been intercepted at close range, with one incident last year coming within just 20 feet of a collision. In the South China Sea, a vital maritime corridor through which about one-third of global shipping passes, Chinese warships have repeatedly approached U.S. Navy vessels at unsafe distances. The Pentagon officially labels these as unsafe and unprofessional maneuvers, but behind closed doors, U.S. commanders warn that a single misstep could escalate into a crisis within hours. The strategic challenge for Washington is clear. If a crisis erupted in the Pacific while the U.S. was still heavily engaged in Europe, the military would face impossible choices about where to concentrate its most valuable assets. Aircraft carrier strike groups, for example, are among America's most visible and flexible tools of power projection, but they cannot be in two places at once. Moving one into the Pacific to deter China would mean taking it away from the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf. The same goes for high-demand assets like strategic bombers, submarines, and cyber warfare teams. In short, the tariff truce buys time for economic diplomacy, but it does nothing to change the trajectory of the military standoff. Beijing's buildup continues, and every exercise, every close intercept, carries the risk of an incident that could force Washington's hand at the worst possible moment, when its attention and resources are already stretched thin by other crises. Meanwhile, the situation in the Middle East remains volatile and unpredictable. According to Reuters, Israel has intensified its airstrikes on Gaza over the past 48 hours, striking what the Israel Defense Forces say are Hamas command centers, weapons depots, and tunnel networks. These underground tunnels, often reinforced with concrete and stretching for miles beneath Gaza's streets, have been used for years to move fighters, store weapons, and launch surprise attacks. For Israel, dismantling this infrastructure is seen as essential to weakening Hamas's military capabilities. Hamas, designated a terrorist organization by both the United States and the European Union, has been in indirect talks with Israel through Egyptian mediators. The discussions reportedly focus on the possibility of a temporary ceasefire, or at least a series of humanitarian pauses, to allow medical supplies and food into the densely populated strip. Gaza's humanitarian situation is dire. According to the United Nations, nearly 2 million residents have limited access to clean water, electricity, and basic medical care. But these negotiations are fragile, and history has shown that even minor incidents can derail them entirely. Regional powers are watching closely, and some are already taking sides. Iran, a longtime supporter of both Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, has issued clear warnings that continued Israeli operations could trigger a broader response. Hezbollah, which fought a brutal war with Israel in 2006, has one of the most heavily armed non-state militaries in the world, with an estimated arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and missiles, many capable of reaching deep inside Israeli territory. If Hezbollah were to open a northern front from Lebanon while Israel is still engaged in Gaza, the conflict could escalate into a full-scale regional war. For the United States, this is not a distant problem unfolding in someone else's backyard. American forces are deployed across the region, including in Iraq and Syria, where they operate from a network of bases to counter ISIS remnants and monitor Iranian-backed militias. These militias have a track record of targeting U.S. personnel. In October 2023, for example, a drone strike on a U.S. base in Syria injured multiple service members, underscoring how quickly American troops can be drawn into local escalations. If fighting in Gaza were to expand to Lebanon, or even more dangerously, draw in Iran directly, Washington could face intense pressure to respond militarily. That could mean deploying naval strike groups to the eastern Mediterranean, increasing air patrols from regional bases, or even carrying out targeted strikes to protect U.S. forces and allies. The challenge is that these moves would consume resources and attention that might otherwise be focused on Europe or the Pacific. This is the classic Middle East trap. Even when U.S. strategy is oriented toward other priorities, events in the region have a way of pulling it back in. Decades of American involvement, from the Gulf War to the Iraq invasion to counterterrorism campaigns in Syria, show that Middle East crises rarely remain contained. They tend to expand, drawing in new actors, inflaming public opinion, and creating long-term commitments that are far costlier than the initial intervention. For American decision-makers, the danger is that a regional conflict here could erupt, just as the U.S. is trying to manage other high-stakes confrontations elsewhere, forcing the country into a multi-front posture it has long tried to avoid. The thread connecting all of this is timing. It's not just that each crisis is dangerous, it's that they are happening simultaneously. Military planners often talk about avoiding a two-front war. For the United States today, the risk is a three-front crisis. From a logistical perspective, the U.S. military is strong, but it cannot be everywhere at once. Aircraft carriers, for example, take months to reposition. Committing one to the Pacific means it's not available in the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf. Sustainment is another challenge. Modern warfare consumes enormous quantities of ammunition, spare parts, and fuel. The war in Ukraine has already stretched U.S. production capacity for artillery shells, prompting the Pentagon to invest in new manufacturing lines. Adding another major conflict or two to that demand could overwhelm the system. There's also the question of political will. During World War II, the U.S. fought in both Europe and the Pacific, but the nation had a unified home front and a wartime economy. Today's political environment is deeply polarized, and sustained public support for multiple overseas commitments is far from guaranteed. Adversaries know this. They may see value in stretching U.S. attention thin, hoping that Washington will prioritize one crisis over another, leaving gaps they can exploit. In the coming days, the Alaska summit will be the headline event. But the real test for Washington will be whether it can navigate that meeting while keeping a steady hand on two other dangerous situations. On August 15th, the stakes are not just about Ukraine. They're about whether the United States can manage simultaneous threats from Russia, China, and the Middle East without losing its strategic balance. Should Washington push for compromises to free up resources, or hold firm even if it risks fighting on multiple fronts? That's the debate shaping up right now. If you've made it this far, you're not just scrolling through headlines, you're digging into the story behind them. Let us know in the comments where you think America's priorities should be, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update. In this kind of environment, a single headline can change the game overnight, and we'll be here to break it down as it happens.